Daniel was the son my parents always talked about at dinner. He was the one whose Little League trophy still sat on the mantle in the living room, the one whose college graduation photo hung in the hallway in a frame with a gold border while mine sat in a cardboard box somewhere in the basement. Growing up in our house in Columbus, Ohio, I spent most of my childhood trying to figure out what I was doing wrong. My older brother Daniel was charming, loud, and easy to love. I was quiet, focused, and apparently easy to overlook. My name is Rachel. I am 31 years old. And for most of my life, I believed that being invisible in my own family was just something I had to accept. My parents are good people in the way that some people are good without really thinking about it. They never meant to make me feel less than. I truly believe that. My mother used to say she loved all her children equally, and she probably believed it too. But love is not just a feeling you carry in your chest. It is something you show up for, again and again, in the small daily choices you make. And in our house, the small daily choices always seemed to bend toward Daniel. When Daniel got a B on his report card, my parents took him out for ice cream and told him they were proud of how hard he tried. When I got straight A's, my mother glanced at the paper and said she hoped I was also making friends and not just studying all the time. When Daniel started his first job at a car dealership after 2 years of community college, my father shook his hand like he had just closed a deal on Wall Street. When I graduated from Ohio State with a degree in computer science, my parents came to the ceremony, left early because my father said his back was bothering him, and did not mention it again for the rest of the summer. I stopped trying to explain this to people after a while. It sounds petty when you say it out loud. Nobody hit me. Nobody called me names. I had food on the table and a roof over my head. But there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being in a room full of people who share your blood and still feeling like a stranger. And that kind of loneliness carves itself into you slowly, the way water shapes stone over years. I moved to Austin, Texas, 3 years after graduation. I told my parents it was for work, which was true. I had taken a position at a mid-sized software company that was building infrastructure tools for healthcare systems. The work was difficult and absorbing, and it was exactly what I needed. The distance helped. When I was not in the same room as Daniel, I stopped comparing myself to him. When I was not watching my parents light up every time he walked through the door, I stopped waiting for that same light to turn toward me. I threw myself into work the way some people throw themselves into religion. I worked early mornings and late nights. I built skills that most people in my department did not have, and I was not shy about using them. Within 2 years, I'd moved from a mid-level developer role into a senior engineering position. Within 4 years, I was leading a team of 12. I was not doing it to prove anything to my family. I had stopped needing to prove things to them somewhere around the age of 26. I was doing it because work was the one place where the rules were clear and the rewards were real. And I was very good at following clear rules and collecting real rewards. What my family did not know, because they had never asked, was that by the time I was 29, I had also been quietly involved in 2 startup investments on the side. A college friend of mine had started a company building patient data software and had offered me equity in exchange for consulting work I did on weekends. I had said yes, mostly because I believed in the idea. What I had not fully anticipated was that the company would be acquired 18 months later by a larger health tech firm for a number that made my hands shake when I read the email. I did not tell my parents. The only person I told was my best friend Maya, who screamed into the phone for approximately 45 seconds straight before she could form words again. I also called my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived alone in a small house in Dayton, and who had always been the one member of my family who actually listened when I talked. She cried a little and told me she was not surprised at all, which made me cry too. With a portion of what I made, I bought a house. Not a starter home, not a condo, not a sensible investment property. A house. 4 bedrooms, wide porches, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a stretch of Texas hill country that turned gold in October and green in April. The property had a guest cottage and a fire pit and a long gravel driveway that wound through cedar trees before you even saw the main house. My realtor told me it was the kind of property people drove 3 hours to photograph in the fall. I paid $2.8 million for it in cash, and I felt completely calm doing it, which I think is how you know you have made the right decision. I did not post about it on social media. I did not mention it in phone calls home. I was not hiding it exactly. I was just not performing my life for people who had never paid attention to it in the first place. My family knew I had done well in tech. They knew I owned a home in Austin. They assumed it was a nice apartment or maybe a small house near a highway. My mother once asked if I had a yard and I said yes, and she said that was nice, and the conversation moved on to Daniel, who was thinking about maybe starting a pressure washing business. This is the context you need for what happened last December. My parents have a tradition of hosting a big Christmas gathering every year. Not just immediate family, but extended family too. My Aunt Linda and her husband drove in from Cincinnati. My cousins, Bethany and Greg, usually came with their kids. My grandmother made the 3-hour trip from Dayton. It was the one time of year the whole family was in the same place. And despite everything, despite the thousand small ways I had been made to feel peripheral, I had always gone. I had always driven or flown back to Columbus, stayed in my old bedroom, which now doubled as a storage room, and shown up for Christmas morning with gifts and a casserole dish and a smile that I held in place through sheer willpower. Last year in early November, my mother called to talk about Christmas. I was in my kitchen making coffee and I put her on speaker while I moved around the room. She said she and my father had decided to do something smaller this year. Just immediate family, she said. Just the 4 of us and Daniel and his girlfriend Kristen. She said it in a tone that suggested this was the most natural thing in the world, the way you might mention you were switching coffee brands. I stood very still for a moment with my mug in my hand. I asked her what about Grandma. She said Grandma could come, of course, it was still family. What about Aunt Linda, I asked. She said it was just going to be too much this year. Too many people. Too much cooking. She wanted a quiet Christmas. I asked if she had talked to Aunt Linda about this, and she said she was going to call everyone this week and let them know. I said okay. I said I understood. And then I said gently that I thought I might do something different this year too then if it was just going to be small. She said, and I want to make sure I am remembering this correctly because I've replayed it many times since. She said, "Oh, I just assumed you would still come, it would be weird without you here." I want you to think about that sentence for a moment. The gathering had been made smaller by removing the extended family. But my absence would be weird. My presence was expected. I was not invited, I was just assumed. I was not a guest to be welcomed. I was a fixture to be counted on, the way you count on a folding chair. You do not think about the folding chair until you need somewhere to sit. I said I would think about it, and I got off the phone and I sat down at my kitchen table and I thought about it for a long time. I called my grandmother that evening. She already knew. My mother had called her earlier that day and told her the gathering was being scaled back, but that she was still welcome to come if she wanted to make the drive. My grandmother, who was 73 years old and had been driving 3 hours to Columbus every Christmas for as long as I could remember, had been told she was welcome to come if she wanted to make the effort. I asked her how she felt about that. She was quiet for a second, and then she said she thought maybe this year she would stay home. Something settled in me when she said that, a kind of clarity I had not felt before around my family. I asked my grandmother if she would want to come to Texas instead. She did not answer right away. Then she said, very quietly, "You have room for me?" I told her I had an entire guest cottage with her name on it. And I told her I was thinking of calling Aunt Linda. My grandmother laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was a real one. The kind that comes from somewhere deep, and I felt it through the phone like warmth. I called Aunt Linda the next morning. I explained what had happened. Not with bitterness, just with the facts. She was quiet for longer than I expected, and then she said, "Rachel, your mother called me on Tuesday and I honestly was not sure what to do with myself." Aunt Linda had been coming to that Christmas gathering for 22 years. She had brought food every year. She had driven 4 hours round trip. Being told she was being scaled out of the family Christmas because things were getting too big was not a small thing. I told her I was hosting Christmas at my place in Texas this year and that I wanted her and her husband there. She started to ask about logistics and then she stopped and said, "Wait, where do you live exactly?" I told her Austin. She said she knew that. She asked what kind of place I had. I told her it was a house with plenty of room and she should not worry about it. She said she would talk to her husband and call me back. She called back in 40 minutes. Over the next 2 weeks, I called my cousins Bethany and Greg. I called 2 family friends who had been regulars at the Columbus Christmas for years and who I knew had also received my mother's scaling back call. I called a few of my own friends from Austin who had nowhere to go for the holidays. And in every call I said the same thing: come to Texas, I have the space. Just bring yourselves. I also called a catering company. I want to be honest about something here. Part of me did imagine what it would look like when people arrived. I am only human. I had spent 31 years being the daughter no one photographed, the one no one called first with good news, the one who was assumed rather than invited. So yes, part of me did think about the moment my aunt would come down that gravel driveway and see the house for the first time. Part of me did think about what my grandmother's face would look like when she stepped onto that wide front porch. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I want to be clear that it was not the main thing. The main thing was simpler and older than any of that. I was tired of showing up for a table where I was taken for granted, and I wanted one Christmas where I sat at a table that I had built myself, surrounded by people who had actually chosen to be there. My grandmother flew in 2 days before Christmas. I picked her up at the airport myself, and when she saw me at arrival, she reached up and put both hands on my face the way she used to when I was small, and she looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "You look like yourself." I did not know exactly what she meant, but I knew it was the best thing she could have said. When we pulled up to the house, she was quiet the whole way down the driveway. When the house came into view through the cedar trees, she made a sound I had never heard from her before. Something between a breath and a word. She asked me if this was really mine. I said yes. She shook her head slowly and said, "Baby, how long have you had this?" I said about 1.5 years. She shook her head again and said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about that question for the rest of the day. Why didn't I tell them? I did not have a clean answer. Part of it was privacy. Part of it was that I had learned over many years not to share my wins with people who would not really receive them. And part of it, if I am being fully honest, was that I had needed this for myself first, before it became something they had an opinion about. Aunt Linda and her husband arrived on Christmas Eve. My cousins came that afternoon with their kids, who ran immediately to the fire pit area and demanded to know if we could make s'mores. We made s'mores. The caterers arrived that evening to set up for the next day. My Austin friends trickled in over the course of the afternoon, and by early evening the house was full of noise and laughter and the smell of the cedar fire we had going on the back porch. My grandmother sat in an armchair near the fireplace most of the evening, and one by one people came and sat near her to talk. She held court, the way older women do when they have earned every bit of the attention they receive. I watched her from across the room and felt something I had been chasing for a long time without knowing what it was called. Christmas morning came cold and clear and blue. The caterers arrived at 10, and by noon the dining table was set for 18 people. There was a turkey, and there was a prime rib, and there were sides I had never had the time or inclination to make myself, but which had now appeared, fully realized, on my table like a promise kept. My aunt cried when she sat down. She said she was not a crier, and then she cried again. After dinner, when the kids were running around outside and the adults were settled in with coffee, my cousin Bethany started taking pictures. She posted a few to her social media that evening with the house visible in the background, the Christmas lights I had strung along the porch railing. The cedar trees lit up against the winter sky. She tagged me in 2 of them. My Austin friend Priya posted a short video from the back porch where you could see the whole expanse of the Hill Country property in the late afternoon light. My phone was in my coat pocket. I did not look at it until after everyone had gone to bed. There were 4 missed calls from my mother. There were 2 texts from Daniel. The first said, "Is that your house?" The second said, "Rachel, call me." There was a voicemail from my father that began with, "Rachel, it's Dad," as though I might not recognize his voice, and then went on for 3 minutes in a tone I had never heard from him before. Not angry. Something more complicated than angry. He said they had seen the posts. He said he did not know I had a place like that. He said he wished he had known. He said he thought maybe we had all been a little out of touch, and perhaps in the new year we should all talk. A little out of touch. I sat with that for a while. The calls continued the next morning. My mother called twice before I had finished my coffee. She said she had no idea I was doing so well. She said she felt terrible that I had been alone for Christmas. I pointed out, as gently as I could, that I had not been alone at all, that I had 18 people at my table. She was quiet. Then, she said, "You could have told us about the house, Rachel." I said I had told her I owned a house in Austin. She said she had not imagined it was like that. I still remember the casual shrug, as she did not know how to explain it either. Daniel called that afternoon. He was more direct, which I appreciated in the way you appreciate cold water. It is uncomfortable, but at least it is honest. He said straight out that he felt left out, that he could not believe I had hosted a big family Christmas without inviting Mom and Dad. I let him finish. Then I said, "Mom called me in November and told me Christmas was being scaled back to just the 4 of you and your girlfriend." I was not disinvited from Christmas, Daniel. I was assumed into it like furniture while everyone else got cut. I decided to do something else. I invited the people who had been cut. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know she called Aunt Linda." I said, "I know you didn't." We talked for almost an hour after that. It was the longest real conversation Daniel and I had had in years. Somewhere in the middle of it, he said something that surprised me. He said he had always assumed I was fine. That I had always seemed fine. That he had never thought about whether I felt included, because I never said anything. I told him I had said things, over the years, small things, and that he had not been listening. He said he thought that was probably true. He did not make excuses for it. He just said it, plainly, and something in me shifted a little. My parents drove down to Austin in January. They told me they were coming for a visit and I said okay, and I spent 2 days not knowing how I felt about it. When they pulled down the driveway, my mother got out of the car and stood in the cold air looking at the house for a long time before she said anything. My father stood next to her with his hands in his pockets. When she finally turned to look at me, her eyes were wet and she said, "Rachel, how did we not know?" I did not have a simple answer for that either. We spent 3 days together. It was not a movie reconciliation. There was no single scene where everything was said and forgiven and wrapped up cleanly. It was more like 3 days of careful conversation, of filling in gaps, of my parents asking questions about my life that they had never asked before and me answering them with the patience I had been practicing for 31 years. My mother walked through every room of the house slowly, touching things, saying almost nothing. My father sat on the back porch for an hour one morning by himself, looking out at the hill country, and when he came back inside, his face looked different in a way I could not name. On the last morning, my mother sat across from me at the kitchen table with her coffee and said, "I think we saw Daniel's life because he was always showing it to us. And I think we missed yours because you stopped showing it to us and we never noticed that you had stopped." I told her she was right. That I had stopped around the age of 24 after one too many conversations where my accomplishments got a polite nod, and then the subject changed to Daniel. She did not defend herself. She just nodded slowly and said she was sorry. I told her I heard her. I told her I was not going to pretend we were starting over from scratch, because we were not. We were starting from where we actually were, which was 31 years of a complicated history that had built real distance between us. I said I was willing to close some of that distance if they were willing to do the work of showing up differently. Not perfectly, just differently. My father, who had been quiet through most of this, looked up from his coffee and said, "You've always been the sharpest one in the room, Rachel." I think I found that a little intimidating. I don't think that's an excuse. I just think it's true. It was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me. My grandmother called me that evening after they left. She asked how it had gone. I told her it had gone as well as it could. She said she was glad. She said she had been hoping for 30 years that my parents would find their way to seeing me clearly. I asked her why she had waited 30 years to say that. She laughed and said she had been saying it all along, just not to me. I told her she was welcome in the guest cottage anytime she wanted to come. She told me she was already looking at flights for spring. I'm not going to tell you my family is fixed. Because families do not work like that, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What I will tell you is that something real shifted last Christmas. My phone rings differently now. My mother calls on Tuesday evenings just to talk, not about Daniel, but about me, about my work, about whether the bluebonnets are out yet along the highway near my house. My father sent me an article last month about a tech company whose story reminded him of something I had described doing years ago. He wrote in the email, "Thought of you." It was 4 words. But he thought of me. Daniel and I text now in a way we never did before. He asked me last week for advice about a business idea he has, and when I gave him honest feedback that included some things he probably did not want to hear, he said thank you and meant it. We are not the siblings we could have been if things had been different, but we are something more real than what we were before, and I will take real over perfect any day. There is one moment from that Christmas I keep coming back to. It was late in the evening on Christmas Day, after dinner, after the kids had finally worn themselves out and the adults had settled into that comfortable quiet that comes at the end of a good day. My grandmother was still in her armchair by the fire. I brought her a cup of tea and sat on the floor beside her chair the way I used to when I was little. She put her hand on my hair and we sat there without talking for a while, listening to the fire and the sound of people who were glad to be where they were. She said, very quietly, "This is yours. You built this." I knew she did not mean just the house.